Conwy, in the north of Wales, in the deep of a 14th century winter. The great castle on the rock above the estuary, 8 drum towers of grey stone, raised for King Edward I in the 1280s under the master mason James of St. George, at a cost of some £15,000, a fortune that could have bought a small kingdom, stands black against a sky the color of cold iron. The afternoon is already failing. This far north, in December, the light does not so much fade as give up, sliding out of the short day by the middle of the afternoon and leaving the towers to the wind and the tide and the dark. And as that light goes out, the greatest building for 100 miles begins quietly to shut itself down for the night. The gates are barred, the fires are banked, the last of the day's business folds itself away, and a household of people, soldiers, servants, officers, grooms, prepares to do the hardest thing this vast stone fortress will ask of them tonight, not to defend it, not to hold it against an army, simply to sleep in it. Because for all its power, a castle after dark was one of the coldest, darkest, most uncomfortable places in the medieval world to try to close your eyes. The stone that turned aside arrows and siege engines also turned aside warmth. The walls that kept an army out kept the heat of the fire from ever quite reaching the corners of the room. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. This is the strange thing at the heart of the castle, the thing our fairy tale picture of tapestries and banquets and rosy firelight quietly leaves out. The castle was not a home in the way we mean the word. It was a machine, a cold stone machine for defense and lordship and the holding of land, and the people who lived inside it bent their nights around what the machine required. Once the gate came down at dusk, a small sealed world closed over them all, lord and lady in their curtained bed, knights and servants on pallets in the hall, the watchman already climbing to the wall. And inside these walls you belonged to the castle. Tonight we are going to spend one long winter night inside such a place, from the barring of the gate at dusk to the dying of the fire and the deep black hours to the cold gray relief of dawn. We will move slowly, hour by hour, through the sleeping fortress, the great hall going quiet, the solar behind its curtain, the kitchens banked down, and always overhead the slow tread of the one man who does not sleep, walking the wall against the dark. There is nothing here to startle you, only a great cold house of stone, 700 years gone, settling into the night. So make yourself warm wherever you are, close your eyes, and let the castle put itself to sleep around you.
Dover, on the coast of Kent in the 1180s. King Henry II is pouring a fortune into the great tower that will crown the cliffs above the narrowest crossing to the continent, some £6,500 across the last years of his reign, an almost unimaginable sum for a single building, more than a king might spend on a small war. The keep his mason raises there is a vast cube of stone, its walls in places as much as 21 feet thick, its floors stacked one above another, its whole enormous weight settled onto the chalk to guard the road that any invader from France would have to take. It was the most expensive, most powerful, most carefully designed building for 100 miles in any direction. and everything about it, the height of the walls, the depth of the ditch, the narrowness of the windows, the very cold of the stone, was there for one set of reasons: to keep enemies out, to hold the country around it, to say to anyone who lifted their eyes to it, who ruled here. What none of it was designed to do, what barely entered the minds of the men who built it, was to be a comfortable place to live. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. This is the first thing to understand about a castle, and it is the strangest because it runs against everything the word has come to mean. We inherited a picture of the castle somewhere along the way, from paintings, from films, from theme parks and children's books, and it is a warm picture. Tapestries on the walls, a great fire roaring in the hall, long tables of food and music and rosy light, and somewhere above it all a canopied bed heaped with furs. It is a picture of a home, a grand one, a romantic one, but a home, a place built in the end for people to be comfortable in. Almost none of that picture is true of the medieval castle, and the part that is true came late and cost dearly and reached only a very few. The real castle was a colder, harder, stranger thing. To see why, you have to stop thinking of it as a house at all. A castle was a machine. It had 3 purposes, and living in it was not one of them.
The first purpose was defense. A castle was a fortress, a thing built to be held by a few against many, to let a small garrison survive an army for weeks or months until help came or the besiegers gave up. Every serious feature served this. The walls were thick, not to hold heat, but to swallow the blow of a battering ram and the strike of a stone flung by a siege engine. Dover's 21 feet of masonry were not for comfort, but for endurance. The ditch was cut deep to keep those engines back. The gate was the weakest point, so the gate was wrapped in towers and traps. And the windows, this is the detail that tells you everything. The windows on the lower fighting levels were not windows at all in our sense. They were arrow slits. Tall, narrow slots, a hand's breadth wide on the outside, splaying inward so an archer could sweep his aim across the ground below while presenting almost nothing for an enemy to hit. They let in a blade of gray light and a knife of cold wind, and they were perfect for shooting. For living behind, they were miserable, but they were never meant for living behind. The second purpose was lordship. A castle was the headquarters from which a lord ruled the land around him, the place he held his court, judged disputes, collected his rents and dues, stored his grain and his treasure, and kept the machinery of power turning. It was an office, a treasury, a courthouse, and a storehouse, as much as it was a stronghold. The great hall, where the household would later bed down for the night, was, by day, the room where the lord sat in judgment, and the business of a whole district was done. The castle governed. People came to it to be taxed, to be tried, to be commanded, and the building was shaped to receive them and to remind them at every step of the power they were approaching. And that was the third purpose: statement. A castle was meant to be seen and to be frightening to see. The sheer scale of it, the cost of it, the way it stood over the town and the road and the river, all of it said the same thing, in stone, to every peasant and merchant and rival lord who looked up at it. This is who holds this land. This is what it would cost you to challenge it. Kings emptied their treasuries to raise stone like this, precisely because the raising of it itself was an act of rule. defense, lordship, power. 3 purposes, and the plain fact of the matter is that the comfort of the people who lived inside came a distant 4th, if it came at all, squeezed into whatever room the fortress could spare once its real work was provided for. Here is the inversion at the heart of the whole thing, the thing worth holding on to as the night comes down. The very features that made a castle strong were the features that made it hard to live in. The thick stone that no army could break was the same stone that drank the heat of every fire and gave it back as cold. The narrow slits that kept arrows out kept warmth and light out with them. The height and mass that made the place defensible made it draughty, echoing and slow to warm. The walls did their work perfectly. Their work simply had nothing to do with the comfort of the body lying against them at night. Comfort was not designed in and then somehow lost. Comfort was never the point. It was sacrificed to the fortress before the first stone was laid. And this was not foolishness, and it was not a failure. It is important to be fair to the people who built and lived this way, because it would be easy and wrong to look back and think them primitive for enduring a cold house. They were doing something entirely rational for the age they lived in. In a world where a rival lord or a foreign army might genuinely arrive at your door, where the difference between safety and slaughter was the height of a wall, you built for the wall first and the fire second. A cold night was survivable. An unwalled night in the wrong century might not be. They chose the cold on purpose, and it was the right choice, and that is the strange, clear logic that our cozy fairy tale quietly forgets. There is a caution to make here, because the medieval castle is not one thing. The word stretches across 5 centuries and every kind of building. The earliest were timber, a mound of earth with a wooden tower on top and a fenced yard below, the motte and bailey thrown up quickly after the Norman conquest of 1066. Those were not the cold stone giants at all. They were something rougher and more temporary. The great stone keeps like Dover came later, through the 12th and 13th centuries, and later still in the 14th and 15th, as the age of the pure fortress began to fade, castles slowly grew more comfortable. Larger windows, wall fireplaces with proper chimneys, private chambers, even glazed glass for the very rich. The cold, dark, communal castle of this story is the high medieval one, roughly the 12th to the 14th century, at the height of its power as a fortress. It is worth being exact about that, because the warmth crept in only at the very end, and only for the few. And whichever castle you stood inside, one thing held true across all of them. A castle was crowded. It was not a private house sheltering a family. It was a populous, tightly ordered little world. The lord and his family, the knights and men-at-arms, the officers who ran the place, the steward, the chamberlain, the marshal, a great household of servants, cooks, grooms, scullions, and in wartime a garrison of fighting men on top of them all. A dozen at the least, 100 or more in a great castle, all packed into a defensible space and all sealed inside it together when the gate came down. A whole small society in stone.
And that society had a shape. Everyone in it had a place, and knew it, and slept where their place said they slept. Once the gate was barred, that order closed over all of them alike, lord and scullion, knight and groom, and held them until morning. Inside these walls, you belonged to the castle. You belonged to its hierarchy, its routine, its safety, and its cold, and there was no stepping outside it until dawn opened the gate again. Even by day, this was a place under guard. High above the packed and busy yards, on the wall walk that ran the top of the battlements, a man paced the stone with a slow, even tread, watching the road, the river, the grey line of the sea. His footfall was the pulse of the place. Back and forth, hour upon hour, a sound the whole household lived beneath without quite hearing it. A castle was never entirely at rest, never entirely off its guard, and that tread on the wall was the proof of it, by daylight and, as we shall see, far more so once the dark came down. The stone would outlast all of them. The lord would die, and his household would scatter, and the garrison would march away to other wars, and the tread on the wall would fall silent at last, and the walls would still be standing. They are standing yet. But that is the end of the story, and we are only at its beginning, at dusk, looking up at the great cold fortress and thinking for a moment of the few hundred people inside it who had to make a bed in a machine that was never built for beds. From today's view, this looks like a magnificent building that somehow forgot to be a home. From their view, a home was never what it was for. It was a fortress that happened to have people sleeping in it. And that's what's so chilling.
Every evening, as the light began to fail, a bell rang across the castle. In French, they called it the couvre-feu, the cover fire, and from that phrase, worn smooth by 7 centuries of English mouths, we get our word curfew. It was the signal that the day was ending, that the fires were to be raked down and covered, that the household was to draw in and the fortress to seal itself for the night. Listen for it, coming across the darkening yard, a single bell, unhurried, telling the whole castle the same thing at once. And the castle obeyed it thoroughly. The last carts came in first. All through the short winter afternoon, the gate had stood open to the ordinary traffic of a working fortress, the water carriers, the wood carts, the men driving in the last of the day's beasts, a messenger, a merchant, a servant sent down to the town on an errand, and now hurrying back before the light went. The gate was the one way in and the one way out, and as the curfew sounded, everything and every one that belonged inside was funneled through it in a last thickening stream. Then the stream thinned, then it stopped, and the great machine of the gatehouse began to close. To understand the closing, you have to understand what the gate was, because the gate was the whole problem of the castle in miniature. The walls could not be climbed and could not be broken. That was the point of them. So the one place an attacker could hope to force was the one place that had to be left open by day, the entrance. And every serious castle answered that weakness by turning its entrance into the strongest and most elaborate part of the whole building. Not a doorway, a gauntlet. At a great gatehouse, the kind raised at Edward I's Welsh castles in the 1280s, or wrapped around the entrances of the Tower of London and Dover, the closing was done in stages, and each stage was a separate line of defense. First, the gates themselves, massive leaves of oak, often plated or studded with iron, swung shut across the passage and barred from within by a great beam of timber dropped into sockets cut deep into the stone on either side. You would have heard the bar go home, a single heavy sound, wood into stone, the most final sound in the castle's day. Then the portcullis. This was the iron-shod wooden grille, its lower spikes hanging like teeth, that ran in vertical grooves cut down the inside of the gate passage and was raised and lowered by a windlass in the chamber above. When the men on the winch let it run, it came down under its own great weight with a grinding rush and a boom as it struck the stone sill, a heavier, deeper sound than the gates.
and where a gatehouse had two of them, front and back, the passage between them became a trap, a stone throat that could be closed at both ends with an enemy caught inside. And where the ground and the water allowed it, a drawbridge over the ditch or moat was hauled up on its chains until it stood flat against the gate like a second door, and the last few feet of the way in simply folded away into the air. Not every castle had all of these. The early timber castles had little more than a barred wooden gate. Many stone castles had no drawbridge at all because they had no wet moat to span. The point is not that every fortress performed every step, but that whatever a castle had, it used, every night, in order, the gates barred, the portcullis down, the bridge raised. The sealing was not an emergency, it was routine. It happened at the same hour, in the same sequence, whether an enemy was within 100 miles or not, because a fortress that only sealed itself when it saw danger coming was a fortress that had already lost. The discipline was the defense. It was built to keep the enemy out, and the enemy, real or not, was kept out the same way every single night. While the gate was closing, the fires were going down. Fire was the castle's second great enemy, and in some ways the more likely one. A building might stand for a century without seeing a siege, but it lived every single day with open flame. Cooking fires in the kitchens, the great blaze in the hall, braziers and candles and rushlights scattered through a structure whose floors, roofs, furniture, and bedding were timber and straw and cloth. A fire loose in the night among sleeping people packed into the dark could do what no army could. And so the curfew was, at its root, a fire law. Its plainest meaning was the most literal: cover the fire. The banking of a hearth was a small, practiced craft. The servants did not put the fire out. To put it out was to lose it, and a cold hearth in the black of a winter morning was hours of labor to rekindle. Instead, they raked the wood down to its embers, drew the glowing coals together into a compact heap at the center, and covered them over, with ash raked from the edges or with a curfew proper, a large domed lid of metal set over the embers to smother the flame while keeping the heat. Banked like this, a fire would not blaze, would not throw sparks, would not catch the rushes on the floor, but it would not die either. It would sit and glow and hold its warmth through the whole night, a red heart under gray ash, so that at first light a servant could rake it open, feed it, breathe it back to life, and have flame and warmth again within minutes. There is something worth holding on to in that covered ember, and we will come back to it before the night is through. For now, only notice it, that as the great fires of the day were smothered one by one, and the light drained out of the rooms, the household did not let the fire die altogether. It banked it. It kept a small, guarded flame alive under the ash, a promise in the deepening dark that the cold and the black did not have the castle entirely, and that warmth could be called back when the light returned.
And as the fires went down, the whole character of the place changed. By day, a castle was loud and open and busy, a yard full of movement, the ring of the smithy, the shouting of grooms, the coming and going of 100 errands. As the curfew sounded and the gate closed and the fires were banked, all of that wound inward and quieted. The animals were secured, the horses in the stables, the last of the beasts penned, the dogs loosed into the yard to keep it through the dark. The day's work was set down, the kitchens finished and were raked out. The household drew in from the open air toward the hall and the chambers, toward whatever warmth and light remained, and the great outdoor world of the daytime castle shrank to the small lit interiors where people would pass the night. Above it all, the change was quietest and clearest of all. The men whose work was the day were done. The men whose work was the dark were beginning. Up on the wall walk, along the top of the battlements, the watch took its place as the yard emptied below, and the slow, even tread of a man pacing the stone began its long circuit against the night. Back and forth, above the settling household, a footstep, a pause, another footstep. The pulse of the castle, passing from the business of the day into the keeping of the night. And then it was done. The gates barred, the portcullis down, the fires banked. A few hundred people sealed inside stone, cut off now from everything beyond the walls. No message in, no soul out until the gray of the morning unbarred the gate again. Whatever the night held, it would be held in here, with them, and them with it. This was the moment, repeated every evening of the castle's life, when the belonging became literal. Out in the daytime world, a servant might be sent to the town, a knight might ride out, the lord might be miles away at his court. But once the bar dropped home and the portcullis struck the sill, the sealed fortress made one thing of everyone inside it. Lord in his solar, knight by the hall fire, groom in the stable, scullion on the kitchen floor, all of them shut in together under the same stone, bound to the same order, kept by the same walls and the same lone watchman overhead. Inside these walls, you belonged to the castle. Not for the evening, for the whole long night, until the light came back and the gate swung open and let the world in again. From today's view, all this barring and lowering and covering looks like a house going to almost paranoid lengths to lock its front door. From their view, it was a war machine doing at dusk the one thing it existed to do, sealing itself on schedule against a world that was simply more dangerous after dark. And that's what's so chilling.
The heart of every castle was its great hall, a single vast room, often the largest enclosed space most people of the age would ever stand in, where the whole household ate together, did business, received guests, and lived out the public life of the fortress. The hall at Penshurst in Kent, built in the 1340s and still standing, rises some 60 feet from its floor to the peak of its great timber roof. The older halls and the greater ones ran on the same enormous scale. By day, it was the warmest, loudest, most crowded place in the castle, and at the center of it burned the fire. In the older halls, that fire burned in the very middle of the floor, on a raised stone hearth, its smoke drifting up through the darkness to escape, some of it, through a louvered opening in the roof high above. That fire was the sun of the castle's whole world, the source of its heat, its light, its cooking, its comfort. Everything turned around it. And it was nowhere near enough. Because a hall built high and wide and strong of cold stone does not hold heat, it loses it, up into the great dark vault of the roof, where the warmest air of the room gathered uselessly against the timbers 60 feet overhead and cooled again, out through walls that were feet thick and never anything but cold to the touch. A fire that would have roasted a small chamber was swallowed whole by a space like this, and gave back at 10 paces almost nothing. This is the fact to hold on to about the great hall, the fact underneath all its grandeur. It was the warmest room in the castle, and it was cold. Consider what the hall was by day first, because you cannot feel the loss of the evening without it. From morning, the hall was the engine room of the whole household. It was where the lord sat to conduct his business and receive those who came to him. It was where the household assembled and ate, and eating, in a great household, was itself a kind of daily theatre of rank.
The tables were trestle tables, planks laid across folding frames, set up along the sides of the hall for a meal and taken down again after, so that the same floor served for dining, for business, for gathering, and, when night came, for sleeping. The lord and his family and honored guests sat at the high table, often raised on a low platform, the dais, at the upper end. Everyone else ranged down the hall below them by degree, nearer the fire or further from it, according to what they were. Where you sat said what you were. The salt cellar on the high table was a marker. To sit below the salt was to know your place in the world exactly. So the hall was not only the warmest room, it was the room in which the whole shape of the household could be seen at once, laid out in a single space, from the lord on his dais to the least scullion by the door. This was where the belonging was visible. A castle at night sealed everyone inside one order. The hall was where evening after evening that order sat down together in the light of the one great fire. Inside these walls you belonged to the castle, and in the hall you could see exactly where in it you belonged.
Then the meal ended, and the hall began to die into night. It was a gradual thing, and an orderly one. The remains of the food were cleared. The trestle tables were lifted from their frames and stacked away against the walls. The frames folded. The benches shifted, and the floor of the hall opened up again. The same rushes underfoot, strewn over the floor, and changed too seldom, giving off their mingled smell of herbs and old spillage and damp. The last of the day's talk and business wound down. If there had been music or a story told by the fire, it ended. People drifted from the hall to whatever else the evening held, and those who would sleep here began slowly to think about where. And through it all the fire burned lower. No one was building it up now. The curfew hour was near or past, and the great blaze of the day was being let down toward the banked embers it would become. As it sank, the reach of its warmth and its light shrank with it, drawing in from the walls, pulling back toward the hearth, so that the cold and the dark that had waited all evening at the edges of the room came forward quietly to take back the space the fire had held. You could stand near the hearth and feel the heat still on your face, and feel at your back the cold of the great room reaching for you. Warmth on one side, cold on the other, in the same moment, in the grandest room for miles. It is worth being exact about the light, because it governed everything about a castle night, and there was so little of it. The fire was the main source, a low red glow now, throwing long, uncertain shadows up the walls and into the roof. Beyond it the household made light as it could afford to. The cheapest and commonest was the rushlight, a length of dried rush, its pith soaked in fat or kitchen grease, that burned with a small smoky flame for perhaps 20 minutes or half an hour before it had to be replaced, held in a simple pinch clip of iron. Then the tallow candle, made of rendered animal fat, which gave a better light, but guttered and smoked, and gave off the smell of the kitchen as it burned. And costliest of all, the beeswax candle, clean-burning, sweet-smelling, bright, which was the light of the chapel, the high table, the Lord's chamber, and reserved in most households for those who could command it. A great household's accounts counted its wax and its tallow carefully, because light itself was a thing that cost money and was spent.
And even all of it together lit almost nothing. This is the part that is hardest for us to picture because we have never truly sat in the dark.
A handful of rushlights and tallow candles and a sinking fire in a room 60 feet long and 60 feet high did not fill the hall with light. They made small pools of it, a bright circle around the hearth, a candle's glow at a table where someone still worked, a lamp by the stair, and beyond those pools the great hall simply went black. The far end of the hall, the high roof, the corners, the doorways, dark. A person could cross the hall at night and pass out of the light and into shadow and out again, and the room around them stayed mostly unknowable, sensed more than seen, its size felt in the way sound moved in it, in the cold coming off the walls, in the draft walking the floor. The light did not push back the dark of the hall. It only marked how much dark there was. Above all of it, through the timber of the roof and the stone of the walls, came the one sound that never stopped, the slow, even tread of the watchman on the wall walk passing overhead. A footstep, a pause, another footstep. Down in the hall, in the last of the firelight, the household could hear him going his rounds above them, back and forth along the battlements, the one man awake and moving in the cold, while the rest of the castle settled toward sleep. It was a lonely sound, and it was a reassuring one, both at once. Someone was keeping the night. The rest of them could let it come. For this was, in truth, the good part of the night, and it is worth saying so plainly before the harder hours. The fire, however far it fell short, was real. The gathering of people around it was real, the whole household drawn in close to the one warm point in a cold stone world, bodies near bodies, dogs stretched at the edge of the hearth, cloaks pulled tight, the low murmur of a room full of people who knew each other settling down together. And the banked ember at the center of the dying fire was a real promise that the dark did not have the hall entirely, that a small guarded flame would live through the night under its ash, and that at dawn it could be raked open and fed, and the whole warm heart of the castle woken back to life. In a cold age, in a cold building, gathered close to a fire that was not enough, but was theirs, this was as warm and as bright and as safe as the night would ever get. And it was about to get colder. From today's view, the great hall looks like the romantic, warm heart we always imagined a castle to have, the fire, the gathering, the long tables in the golden light. From their view, it was exactly that, and no more than that. The one warm place in a fortress of cold stone, doing its best against a room that swallowed heat and light whole, and still cold enough 10 feet from the flames to see your own breath. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. And that's what's so chilling.
England. The winter of 1415 and the winters that followed it, some 25 of them, one after another. A French prince named Charles, Duke of Orléans, lies awake in an English castle, a very long way from home. He is not a prisoner in a dungeon. He is a prisoner of rank, a great lord taken in war and held for ransom, lodged in the chambers of one castle after another across the years, Pontefract in Yorkshire and others besides. He was captured at the Battle of Agincourt on the 25th of October, 1415, pulled alive from beneath a heap of the dead, and he would not see France again for a quarter of a century. And in those long English nights, he did something almost no one else who ever lay awake inside a castle did. He wrote it down. Most of the people who ever slept inside a castle left us nothing, no name, no record, no trace of the cold nights they lay through, the servants on the hall floor, the garrison in the towers, the grooms above the stables, gone entirely from history, their thousands of dark hours unrecorded and unrecoverable. We know they were there.
We know what the knights were like in general, but we cannot stand beside any one of them, because not one of them left a single word. Charles of Orléans left hundreds. Across his long captivity, he composed a great body of verse in French and later in English, ballades and rondeaux, poems of longing and weariness and waiting. And though a poem is not a diary, and he does not tell us the date of any single night or name the exact chamber he lay in, the poems are soaked through with the thing this whole script has been circling: the cold, the dark, the endless waiting for a change that would not come. A man safe inside strong walls and desperately, achingly far from where he wanted to be. Through his verse, across more than 600 years, we can come as close as history allows to standing beside one real person on the inside of a castle night. Consider his situation plainly, the way the record gives it. He was a person of the very highest rank, a prince of the blood of France, a nephew of one king and a cousin of another, which meant that his captivity was as comfortable as captivity got. He was not chained, he was not starved, he was lodged as befitted a great lord, in the good chambers, the private rooms, the warm end of whatever castle held him, with fires and candles, and his own small household of servants. If anyone in a medieval castle was kept warm, it was a man like this. And here is the quiet human fact at the center of it all. Even for him, even in the best rooms the age could offer, the nights were long and cold and dark, and he wrote about them for 25 years.
Because the walls did not care what you were. A prince and a scullion lay under the same cold stone. The prince had more cloaks, a better fire, a curtained bed to hold what warmth there was, but the stone drank his warmth the same as anyone's, and the winter found his chamber the same as it found the hall, and the dark came down over his good bed exactly as it came down over the pallets on the floor below. His rank bought him the softest version of the castle night. It could not buy him a different one. Picture the shape of such a night, as his verse and the plain facts of the place let us reconstruct it. The English winter dark comes early and stays long, 16 hours of it this far north in December. The fire in his chamber, banked down against the terror of flame in a timber-floored castle, sinks to a red glow under its ash and stops giving light. The last candle is put out, or gutters down, and dies, and the room fills from the corners inward with the two things a castle had an endless supply after dark: cold and black. You could lie in the best bed in the building, behind the heaviest curtains, under the most furs, and still feel the cold of the stone reaching in, and still open your eyes to a darkness so complete that there was no difference between eyes open and eyes closed. And into that dark came the sounds. The wind first, the English wind of a Yorkshire winter, finding the arrow slits and the shuttered windows, locking the battlements outside, worrying at every gap in the stone. The settle and crack of the building itself cooling, and overhead or along the wall outside, the one sound that meant the castle was still keeping itself through the night, the slow, even tread of the watchman on the wall walk. A footstep, a pause, another footstep. A prince of France lying awake in the dark of a foreign castle could hear the same lonely footfall above him that every other sleepless soul in the building could hear, the man pacing the cold stone, keeping the night for all of them alight. For on this the walls made no distinction either. Whatever Charles of Orléans had been out in the world, a prince, a poet, the second man in France, once the gate of his prison castle was barred at dusk, he too was simply one more person sealed inside the fortress until dawn, lodged where his rank placed him, kept by the same watch, held by the same stone. Inside these walls, you belonged to the castle. He belonged to it more literally than most. He could not leave. But the belonging was the same in kind that bound the whole household. When the gate came down, the castle closed over the prince and the scullion together and did not let either of them out until the light came back.
What his poems give us, in the end, is not drama. It is something quieter and rarer and far more valuable to a story like this. It is the inside of the feeling, the weariness of a man who has lain through 1,000 of these nights and knows there will be 1,000 more, the longing in the dark for another country and another life, the particular heaviness of waiting for a morning that will be exactly like the last, the sense which anyone who has lain awake in the cold knows that the night is a country of its own and the dawn is a rumor from very far away. He wrote of his heart in mourning, of the long years, of France across the water, and underneath the courtly forms of his verse is the plain animal fact of a person lying awake in a cold room in the dark, waiting for it to be over. And that is the thing worth carrying out of this chapter, gently into the deeper hours of the night. Charles of Orléans is not important here because he was a prince. He is important because he's the one who wrote it down. The single lit window in a whole dark landscape of castles, through which we can actually see a person doing the thing that everyone in every castle did. Behind every dark window, in every fortress, on every winter night for 500 years, there was a person doing this same quiet, cold human thing, lying down in the dark inside stone, listening to the wind and the watchman, pulling the cloak or the furs a little tighter, waiting for the gray light that would unbar the gate. The prince and the scullion and the groom and the nameless girl on the hall floor, all of them the same act, the same waiting, the same cold. Almost none of them left a word. He left hundreds, and through them we can feel, for a moment, what the walls felt like from the inside, the safety of them and the cost of it, in one real chest rising and falling in the dark. There were mercies in it even for a prisoner, the fire banked and kept alive against the morning, the small household breathing in the rooms nearby, the plain fact of the strong walls standing between him and a dangerous world he could not, in any case, have gone back out into that night. The walls that held him prisoner were the same walls that kept him safe. That was the bargain of the castle, made human in one homesick man. From today's view, Charles of Orléans looks like a lucky captive, a prince in comfortable rooms, warm and fed, writing poetry to pass 25 easy years. From their view, from inside his own long dark, the best bed the age could give was still a cold one, and the strongest walls in England still could not keep out the winter or the waiting or the ache of the night. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. And that's what's so chilling.
In all that vast stone fortress, there was almost nowhere that we would recognize as a bedroom. Privacy, as we understand it, a door you close, a room that is yours alone, a bed no one else will see, barely existed, and for most of the household it did not exist at all. At the very top, the lord and his lady had a private chamber. It was called the solar, and it was the one truly comfortable place in the entire castle. And in it stood the one truly comfortable object, a great bed, framed in timber, hung about with heavy curtains that could be drawn closed on every side. That is where the tour begins, but withhold for a beat the thing that tour reveals, because even that best bed in that best room tells the same cold story as the hall floor, only in richer cloth. Everyone in the castle slept outward and downward from that one warm island, and where they slept and on what was not a thing they chose. It was a map of exactly who they were. Start at the top with the solar and the bed, and take them the way a curator would lay out the finest object in the case. The solar was the lord and lady's own chamber, usually set at the upper end of the hall, often above it or beside the dais, reachable by its own stair.
a room withdrawn from the public life of the hall, where the family could be, if not alone, at least apart. And the great bed was the treasure of it. This was the most valuable piece of furniture most households owned, sometimes worth more than everything else in the room together. It was a substantial timber frame, strung with ropes or leather that could be tightened to support the mattress, and around it ran the thing that mattered most, the curtains. Heavy hangings, wool or richer stuff in a great house, suspended from a frame or a tester overhead that could be pulled shut on all sides to enclose the bed completely. And the point of the curtains was simple. The stone chamber around the bed was cold, and it was drafty, and it was not private. So the bed was made into a small room of its own inside the larger cold one. Drawn shut, the curtains held the warmth of the sleepers' own bodies close, kept the drafts off, and closed out the eyes of anyone else in the chamber. Because there were other eyes. A great lord did not sleep alone in the modern sense. Trusted servants, a chamberlain, a body servant, a maid to the lady, often slept in the same chamber, on a truckle bed or a pallet on the floor, within call through the night. The curtained bed gave the lord and lady their island of privacy and warmth, precisely because the room itself offered neither. The bed was warm because the castle was not.
Step down one level to the chambers where the family's other members, honored guests, and the most senior officers of the household slept. In the earlier castles, these were few. In the great keeps and the later houses, there might be several private or shared chambers off the hall and up in the towers. To have a chamber was a real mark of standing, a space with a degree of separation, perhaps a bed of your own, perhaps a small fireplace in the later castles. But it is easy to overstate the comfort. These chambers were still cold stone rooms. Their windows were closed, not with glass. Window glass was a late luxury, reserved through most of the medieval centuries for churches and the very richest, and even then only for the grandest rooms, but with wooden shutters or with cloth soaked in oil to let a little gray light through while keeping the worst of the wind out. A chamber meant privacy and a little warmth. It did not mean the snug bedroom we would picture. It meant a cold room with a door. And now the heart of the chapter and of the sleeping castle, the great hall itself, which by night became a dormitory for much of the household. We have already watched the hall die into evening, the tables cleared, the trestles stacked, the floor opened up, the fire banked to a red glow under its ash. Now the household bedded down in it, where they had eaten, on the same rush-strewn floor. This was where most people slept, not in rooms, here, together, in the one large space, near the one banked fire, in the castle's own warm heart, such as it was. The higher servants might have a pallet and a place nearer the hearth. The lower ones took a bench, or a spot further out, or simply the rushes of the floor with a cloak thrown over them. They slept in their clothes. This was normal, not hardship. The day's tunic and hose were the night's bedding, and a good thick cloak was blanket and mattress and coat all at once. Dozens of people, sometimes more, lay down in a single room, arranged across it roughly by rank, closer to or further from the fire according to what they were. There was no privacy in it, and none expected. The hall held them all through the dark, breathing, shifting, close. There was a real logic to sleeping in the hall beyond mere necessity, and it's worth naming plainly rather than pitying. The hall had the fire, the only banked warmth in the building. It had the company of bodies, and many bodies in one room made their own heat. And it kept the household together, in the place where the household belonged. To sleep in the hall was, to them, not the misery it looks to us. It was to sleep in the warmest, most peopled, most central room in the castle, near the guarded ember, among your own. The floor was hard, and the far corners were cold, but the hall was where the life of the castle was, and it was where, at night, its people naturally lay down.
Now the material inventory, what they slept on and in, top to bottom, the way Anchor 2 lays out a suit of clothes. At the top, the mattress of the great bed, a large sack, sometimes several, stacked, stuffed with feathers and down for the richest, or with wool or flock for the merely comfortable, laid over the roped frame, dressed with linen sheets and wool blankets and fur coverlets, and a heavy counterpane, all of it drawn round with the curtains. Beneath the great bed, and pulled out at night, might be the truckle bed, a low frame on wheels that rolled away under the big one by day, on which a child or a servant slept. Down another degree, in chamber and hall alike, the straw pallet, a coarse cloth sack stuffed with straw, laid on the floor, giving a little softness and a little distance from the cold stone, emptied and refilled when the straw grew foul. Down again, no pallet at all, a bench to stretch out on, or the rushes strewn across the floor, and a cloak for a covering. And against the cold, at every level, the same universal remedy, more of everything piled on top. Cloaks, coverlets, blankets, furs where there were furs, straw heaped up, and, for most, the warmth of the person lying next to you. That closeness was no small thing, and it will matter later. From the curtained bed where lord and lady and a servant on the floor all shared one chamber's warmth, to the hall where 40 people lay near enough to touch, the medieval castle did not sleep apart. It slept together. Bodies near bodies, the banked fire at the center, the piled cloaks. The warmth people made simply by being crowded close was one of the truest comforts the cold building allowed, and they leaned into it because they had to and because it worked. And in all of it, from the top of the household to the bottom, the same fact held. The solar for the lord, a chamber for the guest and the senior officer, a pallet by the fire for the good servant, a bench for the lesser, the bare rushes for the least. No one chose their place. The castle assigned it by rank as surely as it seated them at the meal, and they lay down each night in the exact spot their standing in the household appointed. Where you slept was who you were, made visible in straw and timber and drawn curtains. Inside these walls, you belonged to the castle, and nowhere was that belonging plainer than in the map of the sleeping fortress, every soul in its appointed place under the same stone. Over all of them, from the curtained bed in the solar to the last sleeper on the hall floor, came the same sound through the same stone, the slow, even tread of the watchman on the wall walk above. A footstep, a pause, another footstep. Lord and scullion, guest and groom, each in their appointed place, lay beneath the same footfall, kept by the same man, walking the same cold circuit in the dark.
From today's view, a castle where the lord's own bed had to be curtained like a tent, and 40 people slept on the floor of the dining room, looks like a building that simply forgot to include bedrooms. From their view, every one of those arrangements, the curtained island, the shuttered chamber, the crowded hall floor, was a sensible answer to the same single problem: how to sleep, by rank and in relative safety, inside walls that were never made to be warm. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. And that's what's so chilling.
There are two things about a night inside a medieval castle that almost no film, no painting, no fairy tale ever gets right. The first is the cold, not the cold of a chilly room, but the deep, patient cold of a building made from thousands of tons of stone. Stone that holds the winter in it, that never truly warms, that draws the heat out of a fire, out of a room, out of a body all night long. And the second is the dark.
We have almost forgotten what dark is, and once the fires were banked and the last flame was pinched out, the darkness inside a castle was total, a blackness so complete that a person could lie awake for hours and never know from one moment to the next whether their own eyes were open or closed. Take the cold first, and take it slowly, because the reason for it is the whole counterintuitive heart of this chapter, and the reason is physics, not misfortune. A castle was built of stone, and a great deal of it. The walls at Dover ran some 17 to 21 feet thick at the keep. Other great walls ran the same. That mass was the source of all the castle's strength, and it was the source of all the castle's cold. Stone has what we would now call enormous thermal mass. It takes a very long time to warm and a very long time to cool, and in the depth of winter, a stone wall many feet thick simply never warmed through at all. Month after cold month, the whole building sat at very nearly the temperature of the winter around it, holding the season in its mass, and there was no fire on earth a household could build that would heat thousands of tons of stone from the inside. So the fire never had a chance. The point is simple. When a fire burned in a great hall or a chamber, its warmth went two ways and lost both. It rose up into the high roof, where the warm air gathered uselessly against the timbers far overhead, and cooled again before it could ever come down. And what warmth reached the walls was drunk by the cold stone, which took the heat and gave nothing back, so that a wall 2 feet from the hearth stayed cold to the hand all night. A fire warmed a circle. Stand in the circle, and your face was hot. Step out of it, and the warmth ended almost at once, and the cold of the great stone room closed over you again. This is why a modern person's instinct that a roaring fire would warm the room is exactly wrong for a castle. The room was too big, too tall, too heavy, and it took everything the fire had.
And the cold did not only wait in the walls, it came up through the stone floors, through the rushes, through a straw pallet, into the body of anyone who lay on it. The ground itself in a stone building was a cold surface pressed against you all night, pulling the heat downward out of you into the earth. The cold came from every direction at once, down from the high dark roof, in from the thick walls, up from the flagged floor, so that a sleeper in a castle was not merely in a cold room, but enclosed on every side by cold, held in the middle of it, like a stone held in the middle of a stream. Now, and this matters, none of this made the people who lived there miserable or helpless or doomed. It made them skilled. Being cold was not a catastrophe to them. It was a condition of life they managed every night with a set of practiced, sensible methods, and it is worth cataloging those methods the way the last chapters cataloged the beds, because they worked. They slept in their clothes. The day's woolen tunic and hose became the night's first layer, and over it went the cloak, a thick, heavy, oiled or felted wool cloak that was coat and blanket and mattress all at once, the single most useful object a person owned. They slept close, 2, 3, many bodies in a bed or on a pallet or across a hall floor made a shared warmth that no one of them could have made alone. The heat of the person beside you was, for most people, most nights, the best heat available, and they used it without a second thought. They piled on weight, coverlets, wool blankets, furs for those who had them, more straw, more cloaks. They drew the bed curtains shut, turning the great bed into a small tent that trapped the sleeper's own warmth around them. They packed straw for insulation between body and stone. And at the center of it all, the banked fire kept its guarded ember through the night, not warming the room, but alive, a promise of morning heat held safe under its ash.
People were good at being cold. This was competence, not suffering, and it is closer to the truth of the castle night than any image of shivering wretches. Then the fire sank to its ember, and the last candle went out, and the second great fact of the night came down over everything: the dark. It is genuinely hard for a modern person to understand this, because we have never truly been in it. We have never been more than a few feet from a switch. But before artificial light, in a stone building at night, with the fire banked to a covered glow and the last flame pinched, the darkness was complete in a way we simply do not meet anymore. Not dimness, not shadow, blackness, edge to edge, floor to roof, filling the whole vast room so evenly that there was nothing at all for the eye to find. A person could hold a hand before their face and see nothing, could lie with eyes wide open and eyes shut and feel no difference between the two. The dark swallowed the whole world and left only the inside of the head and the surface of the skin.
And into the space where sight had been, the other senses came forward to fill it. In the total dark, the ear did the work the eye could not. A castle at night was not silent. It was full of small, close, particular sounds that daylight had drowned. The wind finding the arrow slits and the shutters, walking the battlements, worrying at every gap in the stone. The building itself settling and ticking as it cooled, the old timbers of the roof shifting overhead. The breathing of many sleepers in one room, the rustle of straw as someone turned, a dog resettling by the dead fire, and through all of it, from above, the one sound that never stopped and that a sleepless person in the black could hold on to like a hand in the dark, the slow, even tread of the watchman on the wall walk. A footstep, a pause, another footstep. Up there, in the cold, one man was awake and moving, walking his circuit above the sleeping house, and down in the darkness the sound of him was proof that the world still had a shape, that time was still passing, that morning was somewhere ahead. In the total dark, that footfall was the human pulse of the whole castle. And there was so much dark to get through. This is the quiet weight underneath the whole chapter. A deep winter night at English latitudes is not the 8 hours of darkness a modern city dweller imagines. It is 15, even 16 hours of it, from an afternoon dusk to a mid-morning feeling dawn. People faced twice the darkness we do, night after night for months, and they did not lie in it in one unbroken stretch of sleep the way we try to. There is a genuine and fascinating body of scholarship, most associated with the historian Roger Eckerch and still debated among historians, suggesting that before artificial light, many people slept in 2 phases: a first sleep in the earlier part of the night, then a wakeful hour in the deep dark, when they might lie quietly, or pray, or talk low with whoever shared the bed, and then a second sleep until dawn. Whether or not it held true everywhere, it points at something real. The long winter night was not a problem to be endured in a single unconscious rush. It was a country you lived in for 16 hours, part sleeping and part waking, in the cold and the black, with the wind and the watchman for company. And in that country, the walls were the whole world. Sealed in by the barred gate, wrapped in the total dark, held in the cold stone, a person could not see the room, could not see the others, could not see anything at all, only feel the warmth of the sleeper beside them, and hear the tread above, and know that the fortress stood around them in the black. There was nothing else, no outside, no horizon, no world beyond the stone until the light came back. Inside these walls you belonged to the castle, never more completely than in the deep of a winter night, when the walls were all there was, and the only warmth in the world was the person breathing beside you, and the ember waiting under the ash.
That ember and that shared warmth were the real mercies of it.
The fire kept alive against the morning and the heat of another body against the cold, and we will come back to them before the night is out. From today's view, this is a cold we would find nearly unbearable, and a dark we can hardly imagine. 16 hours of black in a building that never warmed, a thing to be escaped with a thermostat and a switch. From their view, it was simply what a winter night was, the ordinary condition of the world after dusk, met with a cloak and a companion and a banked fire, and lived through, night after night, without complaint, because there was nothing else it could be. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. And that's what's so chilling.
While the great whole slept, the castle did not. It only grew quiet and emptied down to the few whose work was the night itself. Somewhere in the dark, a servant whose whole task was the fire moved to the banked hearth and raked it, and fed it just enough to keep the embers alive until dawn. In the stables, a groom lay among the horses, waking at their movements in the straw. And long before there was any light in the sky, in the cold of the deepest part of the night, someone was already awake in the kitchens, because bread does not make itself, and a household of 100 people would want feeding when the sun came up. A castle at night was not a sleeping thing. It was a resting thing, kept alive by a handful of hands in the dark. To understand those hands, you have to understand the thing they served, which was one of the largest and most orderly human communities of the age, the great household. We touched it in the first chapter, the crowded world inside the walls, the dozens or hundreds of people the castle held. Now, in the quiet of the night, is the time to see how it was made, because it was not a crowd, it was a machine, with named parts, and every part had its place. At the head of the working household stood the great officers, the steward, the seneschal, who governed the whole estate and household in the Lord's name, the highest of the servants, and often a man of rank himself. The chamberlain, who ran the Lord's private chambers and household within doors, and to whom the body servants answered. The marshal, who kept the hall, the horses, the stables, and often the discipline and lodging of the household. The butler, who kept the wine and ale and the buttery. And beneath these great officers ran the long descending ranks that actually did the work, the ushers and pages of the hall, the cooks and their scullions in the kitchen, the grooms of the stable, the chandler who kept the candles and lights, the porters at the gate, the boys who carried and fetched and scoured. How many of these there were depended entirely on the house. A small knight's castle might run on a dozen servants. A great magnate's household could number well over 100, and a royal one many hundreds more. But large or small, the shape was the same, a pyramid of offices and duties, each rank knowing its work and its place. Much of what we know of this comes from surviving household ordinances, the written regulations great lords drew up to govern their establishments, which lay out the offices and their duties in careful detail. By day, the whole engine ran at full speed. At night, it did not stop. It slowed and shrank to the skeleton crew whose duty was the dark hours. And it is those few, moving quietly through the cold, sleeping castle, that this chapter is about.
Take the fire first, because it was the most vital of the night duties and the easiest to overlook. In a castle full of timber floors, wooden furniture, strewn rushes, and stored straw, fire was the great terror of the dark, and yet the household could not simply let every frame die, because it needed the fire alive in the morning. So the banked hearth was watched. Through the night, a servant tended it, keeping the embers covered and safe under their ash so they could not spit or spread, and yet alive, raking them, feeding them the smallest necessary amount, guarding the guarded flame. This was the fire watch, and it was two duties at once, to keep the fire from dying and to keep it from waking into something that could kill the whole sleeping house. The ember that would light the morning depended all night on a pair of hands in the dark that did not sleep. Near the top of the sleeping household, other servants kept a different kind of watch. The lord and lady did not sleep alone. The personal body servants, a chamberlain's man, a valet, a maid to the lady, slept in or just outside the chamber, on a truckle bed or a pallet, sometimes quite literally across the doorway, so that a call in the night would be answered at once. Their duty was simply to be there, to be within reach through the dark hours, ready to bring a light, tend the chamber fire, fetch what was needed, answer the household's head if the night required it. They slept, but they slept on duty, with one ear kept for the room. Out in the stable, the grooms lay among the animals. Horses were among the most valuable things a castle held. The war-horse of a knight could be worth a small fortune, and they could not be left untended through a long night. So a groom bedded down in the straw among them, warmed a little by their great bodies, waking at a change in their movement or their breathing, ready to quiet a restless animal, to check a colicky horse, to keep the stable safe. It was, in its way, one of the warmer places to pass a night in the castle, and one of the most constant duties. And around it all moved the checking and the securing of the place, the porter at the barred gate, the servants who saw the doors made fast, the care of any who were sick and needed watching through the dark. On the walls above, hardest of all the night duties, stood the watch itself. But the watch has its own chapter and its own cold, and we will climb to it next. For now it is enough to know that it was there, the topmost thread of the same quiet machine.
Then, in the deepest and coldest of the night, hours before any gray touched the sky, the day began. It began in the kitchen and the bakehouse. Bread was the foundation of every meal, and bread is slow. The oven had to be lit and brought to heat. The dough that had been set had to be worked, the whole long process begun in the dark so that loaves would be ready when a household of scores of people woke hungry. So the kitchen servants rose first and rose coldest. Someone carried a rushlight down a black passage to the kitchen. Someone woke the kitchen fire from its embers or carried flame from the banked hall hearth. Someone drew the water, hauled the fuel, set the great pots. The first cold clatter of the day sounded in the kitchen, while the rest of the castle still lay in the dark, and the smell of the first bread began, slowly, to move through the cold air of the sleeping fortress, the truest sign that the night was ending and the machine was waking. Here is the plain shape of it, stated once and left to rest. Rank decided who slept. The lord and lady slept warm, private and largely undisturbed, behind their curtains, with servants at hand to answer the night. The great officers slept, and the lowest servants, the scullions, the kitchen boys, the fire watch, the grooms, slept least, slept coldest, and rose earliest, so that those above them could wake to warmth and bread and order. This was not thought cruel. It was simply how the household was made, top to bottom, sleeping and waking alike, a hierarchy of rest, as fixed as the hierarchy of the hall and the sleeping places, in which the comfort of the few was built quite literally on the wakefulness of the few others in the dark. And this is where the belonging of the castle showed its plainest face. For the night household, there was no line between your life and your duty. Your hours themselves belonged to the castle's order. You slept when your office allowed it, and woke when it demanded, at whatever cold hour the fire or the horses or the bread required. Inside these walls, you belonged to the castle.
The servant raking the ember at 3 in the morning belonged to it as completely as anyone ever had, his sleep given up to the house's need, his cold hours the price of the household's warm ones.
Over all of them, through the stone, ran the same thread of sound that ran through every chapter of the night, the slow, even tread of the watchman on the wall above. A footstep, a pause, another footstep. And now, in the working dark, other small sounds kept it company. The soft rake of iron on the banked hearth, a horse shifting in the stable straw, the first stir of the kitchen far below. The quiet noises of a human machine ticking over through the night, with the watch's footfall the loudest and steadiest thread in it, marking the hours for the sleepers and the workers alike. And this was the answer, in the end, to the whole cold problem of the castle. The building could not keep anyone warm. The stone only held the winter. What warmth survived the night survived in human hands, the fire servants, not the fortresses. It was the servant crouched at the hearth in the dark, and not the mighty walls, who kept the one ember alive from dusk to dawn, so the household could wake to a living fire. The castle kept out the enemy. The household kept in the warmth. From today's view, a great house where the poorest rose at 3 in the cold to bake bread for the warm and sleeping rich looks like a plain injustice, and in a way it was. From their view, it was simply the household running as households ran, the night crew keeping the machine alive through the night, so the morning could arrive in order, each in the place the castle gave them. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. And that's what's so chilling.
While the whole castle slept, one man did not. High on the wall walk, wrapped against a cold that the sleeping household below could barely imagine, the watchman walked his round, back and forth along the battlements, hour after hour, through the deepest and darkest part of the night. He was looking for the one thing the whole fortress had been built to stop, and the one thing that, if it came, would come out of the dark without warning. Most nights he saw nothing. Most nights there was nothing to see, and that was the strange, cold heart of his duty, to stay awake and watchful and freezing all night, every night, against a danger that almost never came, because the one night it did, everyone below him would be asleep. For 8 chapters we have heard him, the slow, even tread on the wall overhead, coming down through the stone into the great hall, into the solar, into the black of the sleeping chambers, a footstep, a pause, another footstep, the one sound that never stopped, the human pulse of the whole castle in the dark. Now, at last, we climb the stair and stand beside him and see what that footfall really was. It was this, one cold, lonely, wakeful man walking a circuit of stone against the night so that everyone below could close their eyes. Take the duty itself first, plainly the way it was actually organized, because it was organized, and that is the first thing to understand. The night watch was not one man's whim, it was a discipline run on a rota. In a garrisoned castle, the watch was divided into turns so that no single man stood the whole night, and the guard changed at set points through the dark. A fresh watchman coming up cold from a short, broken sleep to relieve the one whose turn was done. He walked the wall walk, the allure, the passage running behind the battlements along the top of the wall, pacing his fixed circuit past the merlons and the arrow loops. At intervals he called the hour and the state of the watch into the dark, a cry that told the castle that time was passing and that all was well, and told the other guards and anyone awake below that the man on the wall was awake too. At the gate, the challenge and the password. No one passed in or out in the dark without giving the word, and a figure approaching the walls at night was called to and made to answer before anything else happened at all. The rounds, the calling of the hours, the challenge and the changing of the watch, this was the machinery of keeping a fortress through the night, and on the overwhelming majority of nights it was, in the plainest sense, boring, which was exactly what a well-kept watch was supposed to be.
Now the cold, because the watchman met it, as no one else in the castle did. Everyone below had something, a fire's memory, a roof, a wall at their back, the warmth of a body beside them, the drawn curtains of a bed. The watchman had none of it. He stood on the most exposed surface of the entire building, the open top of the wall, with the wind that had been merely worrying at the arrow slits below, now full upon him, walking the battlements, finding every gap in his cloak. The cold that Chapter 6 described, the deep, patient cold of stone in winter, he did not shelter from it. He stood in it, in the open, for hours, while it did what cold does to a body kept still and unfed in the dark, worked inward, settled into the hands and the feet, made the simple act of staying alert a labor. He walked partly to watch and partly simply to keep moving, because to stand still on a winter wall walk through the small hours was its own slow danger. His breath went out white into the black and was gone. This was the sharpest point of the whole hierarchy of rest, in a household where rank decided who slept warm and who rose coldest. The watchman was the coldest and most wakeful of all. The man who gave up not only his sleep, but his shelter, so the rest could keep theirs. And he was alone. This is the human weight of it, and it is worth sitting with quietly. Below him lay the whole sleeping castle, scores of people breathing in the dark, the banked fire, the close warm press of the hall, a whole community at rest. And he was outside of all of it, above all of it, awake in the one place where there was no company and no comfort, with only the wind and the dark and the far empty country beyond the walls. The vast sleeping silence of the fortress was under his feet, and he was shut out of it by his duty, keeping a solitary vigil over a peace he was not permitted to share. Belonging, for the watchman, was the hardest thing it ever was for anyone. His night, his rest, his very warmth and safety, all handed over to the castle and the household he guarded. Inside these walls you belonged to the castle, and no one belonged to it more wholly or more coldly than the man on the wall. So why? Why set a man to freeze all night against an empty dark? Because the dark was when the danger came, and the household knew it in their bones, and the whole grim design of the castle, cold, sealed, black, and guarded, was the answer to that knowledge. The threats were real, and it is right to name them, calmly, the way they were understood. There was the surprise attack in the night, the escalade, the scaling of the walls in the small hours with ladders under cover of the dark, an attempt to be over the battlements and inside before a sleeping garrison could wake and arm. There was treachery, which the chroniclers record again and again as one of the commonest ways a castle actually fell. Not a wall broken, but a gate opened from within, a guard bribed, a postern unbarred by a traitor, the great machinery of Chapter 2's sealing undone by one disloyal hand in the dark. There was fire, the constant terror in a place of timber floors and stored straw and strewn rushes, which could do in a night what an army could not. And there were the plain small dangers of the dark itself, a fall on a black stair, the cold that could kill a man left too long and unwatched.
These were not fantasies. They were the reasons the gate was barred, the fire banked and watched, the walls patrolled, the real, ever-present possibilities that a fortress existed to guard against, and that the night made most dangerous of all. But, and this is the whole quiet, dark thesis of the chapter, they almost never happened. The escalade, the opened gate, the night assault. Across the long life of most castles, these were the rare nights, the ones the chroniclers remembered precisely because they were exceptional. The truth of the watch was not a nightly battle. It was the opposite of a battle. It was 10,000 uneventful nights of one cold man walking a wall and seeing nothing, calling the hour into a darkness that held nothing, straining against sleep and the cold for the sake of a danger that did not come, and could not be allowed to find them unready on the one night in 1,000 that it did. That was the real darkness of the castle night, not the attack, the endless, freezing, wakeful watchfulness against the mere possibility of one. The dread was not in what happened on the wall, it was in what might, and almost never did, and could never be assumed away. And in that figure, the whole fortress finally resolves. Everything this script has walked through, the mass of cold stone, the barred gate, the dying hall, the black chambers, the household bedding down by rank, the hands kept awake to guard the fire, all of it was the same single bargain, and the watchman was its plainest form. He kept the enemy out, all night, every night, in the killing cold, unsheltered and alone and awake, he kept the enemy out. And the price of it was written on him more clearly than on anyone else, that the man who guaranteed the castle's safety was the coldest, most wakeful, least comforted person inside its walls. The purpose of the fortress and the price of the fortress meeting in one freezing figure on a dark wall. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. And the watchman paid both halves of that sentence at once, all night, with his own body.
He walked his round. A footstep. A pause. Another footstep. The same slow tread the sleepers heard through the stone below, and never thought about, and were kept safe by. And somewhere in the last and coldest part of his watch, the hour when the dark was oldest and the cold was deepest, and the whole world seemed to have been night forever, the thing he was truly waiting for on almost every night he ever stood, at last began to come. Not an enemy, a change in the black along the eastern edge of the world. The faint, gray, immeasurably slow loosening of the dark that meant the night was ending, that he had kept it again, that below him the household would soon stir toward a living fire and warm bread and another ordinary day bought by his cold hours. The watch was almost over. The mercies of the morning were almost near. From today's view, a man freezing alone on a wall all night to guard against an attack that would not come looks like a hardship close to pointless, a cold vigil over nothing. From their view, it was the price of every safe night's sleep the household ever had, one waking man in the cold, so that scores could rest in the dark, against the rare and terrible night when the watching would be the only thing that saved them. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. And that's what's so chilling. There is a temptation after everything we have walked through. The cold stone that never warmed, the barred gate, the dying hall, the black chambers, the deep winter dark, the household that never slept, the lone, freezing watch against the night. To leave the castle there, in the cold, and call that the whole truth of it. But it is not the whole truth. It was never the whole truth. Because inside that hard night, folded into the very same cold and dark and stone, there were small, warm human things, real things, plain things, things a person could hold on to, that made even a night in a cold fortress a night a person could rest. 3 of them especially, 3 small mercies, and they, and not the cold, deserve the last word before the dawn. Here is the first. You did not sleep alone. This is the mercy the whole modern world has quietly lost, and it was real, and it was constant. Almost no one in a castle slept in solitude. We saw it in the great hall, and we saw it in the sleeping places, the household bedded down close together, family and servants and retainers on shared pallets and benches near the banked fire, and the dogs came in among them, curled warm against a back or across a pair of feet. Under piled cloaks and shared coverlets, 2 and 3 and more to a bed or a pallet, bodies lay close in the dark. And the plain animal comfort of that, the heat of another person along your side, the weight of a dog against your spine, the sound of breathing all around you in the black, was real, and it was human, and it was, on the coldest nights, the best warmth there was. No one lay awake in an empty room. When the cold came in from the stone and down from the roof and up from the floor, the answer was not a thicker wall or a hotter fire, because there was such thing. The answer was the person beside you and the person beside them, the household making with its own gathered bodies the warmth the fortress could not give. It is nearly the opposite of how so many sleep today, alone in a heated room behind a shut door. In the castle, warmth was something you made together, and company was not a luxury of the night. It was the night's first mercy, and its plainest. Here is the second. The fire was kept alive.
Through the whole black length of the night, the household was never wholly surrendered to the cold and the dark because a fire was kept. Not blazing, we know it could not blaze, the room was too great and the fuel too dear, but banked, its embers raked together and covered over with ash, guarded down to a small, steady core of heat that would not die. And we know now whose work that was, the hands in the dark, the fire servant who moved to the hearth in the deepest part of the night and raked it and fed it just enough so that the one ember lived. Think of what that small kept flame meant, lying there under its gray ash while the whole castle slept around it. It meant the cold was not forever. It meant the dark was not total after all, that somewhere in the great black room a faint red warmth was being carried faithfully from the fire of last evening to the fire of tomorrow morning across the whole width of the night. The banked hearth was a promise, and it kept itself all night long, that the household would not have to strike everything cold and dead from nothing at dawn, that it could be woken back to warmth and light, that morning would be warm because a little of the evening's fire had been kept alive to meet it. In a cold that pressed from every side, one small guarded flame was held back from the dark. That was the second mercy, the kept fire, and the promise it made and never broke. And here is the third, and the deepest, and the one this whole long night has been quietly building toward. The walls held. For all its cold, and the cold was real, and we have not pretended otherwise, the fortress did the one thing it was truly built to do. It kept them safe. Behind the barred gate, under the watch on the walls, inside all that thickness of stone, a whole household of people lay down in a dangerous age and slept through the night in real safety. This was the thing the cold bought. This was the bargain seen at last from the side of what it gave rather than what it cost. The stone that would not warm was the same stone that would not yield. The gate that sealed them into the dark was the same gate that sealed the danger out.
The walls that held the winter in their mass were the walls that held the night and everything the night might carry on the far side of them. In a world where darkness could bring real threat, to lie down and close your eyes and simply trust that you would wake, that the morning would come and find you and yours unharmed, was not a small thing. It was, perhaps, the largest gift the hard fortress had to give, and it gave it every single night, plainly, without fuss, to everyone inside, the deep, quiet, unglamorous safety of stone that held.
And high above them, walking the wall through the cold, was the watchman, and hear his footfall now, one last time, as the sleeping household heard it. The slow, even tread on the stone overhead. A footstep. A pause. Another footstep. Through 8 chapters, that sound has been many things. A metronome in the dark, the pulse of the castle, and finally, up on the wall, a lonely cold burden borne by one man. But from below, from inside the warm, close press of the sleeping hall, it was none of those things. It was a comfort. It was the sound that told the household, without their even waking to think it, that someone was keeping the dark for them, that they could let go and sleep, because a waking man walked the wall above, and the gate was barred below, and the fire was alive at the hearth, and the person beside them was warm. The same footfall that was vigil to the watchman was reassurance to the sleeper. The loneliest sound in the castle was also its kindest. This is the turn the whole script has been moving toward, and it is gentle, and it is this. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. And so the household made its own warmth where the fortress gave none. It made warmth out of company, bodies close together under piled cloaks against the cold. It made warmth out of a kept fire, one guarded ember carried faithfully across the dark to the morning. And it took from the cold, hard stone itself the one warmth the stone could give, not heat, but safety, the deep security of walls that held. 3 small mercies, made and kept by human hands inside a building that offered none of them freely. The shared heat, the living fire, the held walls. Enough together to make even a night in a cold stone fortress a place a person could truly rest. And this, in the end, is the gentlest answer to what it meant to belong to the castle. Inside these walls you belonged to the castle, and to belong to it, we can finally say, was not only to give your warmth and your rest and your hours to its warder, it was also to be held by it, to be warmed by your fellows in its dark hall, kept by its guarded fire, and shielded by its stone through the dangerous night, to be one of the many bodies breathing close together in the safe black, kept alive and kept warm and kept safe until the morning. To belong to the castle was to be gathered in, and that belonging in the deep of the cold night was the thing that made the cold bearable.
So let the castle rest there now, as the night wears toward its end. The household close together in the dark, warm with each other's warmth under the piled cloaks. The banked fire glowing its small, steady red at the heart of the hall, waiting patiently for the morning. The gate barred, the walls holding, the watchman walking his slow round above, with his footfall coming down soft through the stone. And at last, at a single arrow slit high in the eastern wall, the first faint gray of the coming dawn, thin and cold and certain, beginning very slowly to arrive. From today's view, 3 mercies as small as company, a banked fire, and a locked door seem like very little to set against so much cold and dark. From their view, they were nearly everything, the warmth of one another, the flame kept alive against the morning, and the safety of the walls that held,
the small kept comforts that made the hard night a night a whole household could sleep through and wake from and live. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. And that's what's so chilling.
For 400 years and more, the castle was the strongest thing in the land. It was the answer to the danger of the night, the stone that kept the dark and the enemy out, that held whole households safe behind its barred gate and its watched walls, night after night, age after age. And then, over the space of a few generations, it simply stopped being needed. Gunpowder came, and cannon, and the tall stone wall that had defied armies for centuries became not a shield, but a target, something a good gun could bring down in an afternoon. And as the land grew quieter and its rulers grew stronger, the people who could once only have lived behind walls began instead to build for comfort, houses with wide glazed windows and warm rooms, and no thought of a siege, because the siege was no longer coming. One by one, the great cold fortresses were left, not destroyed, most of them, just no longer needed. And a castle that no one needs is a very quiet thing. Take the guns first, because they were the beginning of the end, and they worked slowly. For most of the Middle Ages, the tall stone wall was the master of war. It was too high to climb easily, too thick to break, and an attacker's only real choices were to starve it out, to trick it, or to spend lives against it. The great height and thickness we have walked all night, the 17 and 21 feet of stone at Dover, the towering curtain walls, were the whole point, and for centuries they won. But from roughly the later 15th century onward, effective gunpowder artillery changed the arithmetic. A tall wall, which had been a castle's greatest strength, became its greatest weakness. High and brittle and standing proud against the sky, it was exactly the sort of thing a heavy gun could batter and bring down. The answer, where men still needed to fortify, was to build the opposite of a medieval castle: low, thick, sloped, angled earth and masonry works designed to absorb a cannonball rather than stand tall against it. The soaring stone keep, the thing the whole age had trusted, quietly became obsolete. Not overnight, not everywhere at once, but surely, over generations, the castle stopped being the strongest thing in the land because a new thing could knock it down. And here is the quiet, satisfying turn that the whole long night has been moving toward. As the guns made the tall wall obsolete, something else was happening at the same time, and it was gentler. The land was growing more settled. Central royal power was growing stronger, reaching further, keeping a peace that a private lord had once had to keep for himself behind his own stone. The great baronial households no longer lived in perpetual readiness for a war that might arrive at their own gate. And so the wealthy and the powerful, who had once had no choice but to live behind walls, began to build differently. They built undefended country houses and manor homes, houses designed not for a siege, but for a life, houses with large glazed windows that let the light pour in where the medieval castle had allowed only the narrow arrow slit and the shuttered gap. Houses with warm, well-lit private rooms, built for comfort and for pleasure and for family, with no barred gate, no portcullis, no watch on the walls, because there was nothing left to keep out. Think about what that meant, against everything we have said all night. The whole thesis of the medieval castle was a hard bargain. To be safe, you had to be cold. To keep the enemy out, you built a thing that could never keep you warm. And here, at the end of the age, that bargain simply dissolved.
The moment safety no longer had to be built in stone, the moment the king's peace and the settled land did the work the walls had done, people were free at last to build for warmth. The country house was the castle's answer to itself. When you no longer needed to keep the enemy out, you could finally build to keep yourself warm. And so they did, and they left the cold fortresses behind them to do it. What became of those fortresses varied, and it is worth naming the fates plainly. Many were simply abandoned, a family moving out of the cold, inconvenient old keep and into a comfortable new house nearby, leaving the castle to stand empty, its purpose gone. Emptied of its household, robbed over the years of its cut stone and its timber and its lead for use elsewhere, open to the weather that worked patiently at it season by season, such a castle fell, slowly and quietly, into ruin. Others met a sharper end. Some were slighted, deliberately rendered indefensible, their walls breached, and their towers thrown down so that they could never again be held against authority, though the most famous wave of English slighting came later, in the upheavals of the 17th century, well beyond the medieval night this documentary has walked, and it belongs to another story than ours. Either way, whether by slow neglect or by deliberate hand, the great fortresses that had once ruled the night passed out of use. The age that it needed them was over, and they were left to the grass and the wind. And yet, and this is the whole reason we can stand here at all, the stone remains. Walk up to one of them now, at the gray end of a day, and this is what is left. A ruined keep standing on its hill, open at the top to the sky where a roof once was. The great hall, its walls still rising, but the fire long dead, and the floor open to the rain. The high windows empty of everything but light. A worn spiral stair, its steps hollowed by feet 7 centuries gone, winding up around its newel to a floor that is no longer there, a stair that now climbs to nothing but air. The arrow slits through which the cold once came, and through which the wind still comes, whistling thin and steady as it always did. A cold hearth, a great empty stone fireplace in a wall, where the banked fire was once guarded through the night, and where nothing has burned in 500 years. And along the top of the wall walk, the allure where the watch once trod its endless round, now grassed over, walked by no one, silent. Listen there, and you will notice the thing that is missing. All night, through every chapter, there was a sound, the slow, even tread of the watchman on the wall overhead, a footstep, a pause, another footstep. It was the pulse of the castle, the one thing that never stopped, the sound that measured every hour of every night the fortress ever kept. And it is gone. The wall walks stand empty now. There is no footfall on the stone, only the wind, moving along the battlements where the watch once passed, in a silence the living castle never once knew. The metronome that marked the castle night has fallen still at last. But the stone remembers. That is the strange, quiet endurance of these places. The households are 7 centuries gone, the lord and the lady behind their curtains, the servants on the hall floor, the groom among the horses, the fire servant at the hearth, the cold man on the wall, all of them long dust, their names mostly lost, their one particular night unrecorded and unrecoverable. And still the walls that held them stand. Inside these walls you belonged to the castle, and though everyone who ever belonged to it is gone, the stone that held their belonging is still here, still standing on its hill, still keeping the shape of the lives that were lived inside it.
The hollowed stair remembers the feet, the blackened hearth remembers the fire, the empty wall-walk remembers the watch. The castle outlived the whole age that built it, and it kept in its cold stone the memory of every night it ever passed. And to stand in a ruined keep at dusk, with the wind in the arrow slits and the first cold of evening coming down, is to feel something we have almost entirely engineered out of our own lives. We have made the cold go away, and the dark, and the danger. We sleep warm and alone and safe behind thin walls, and we think nothing of it. But here, in the cold, open stone, the old realities are still faintly present, the cold that never left, the dark that was total, the closeness of many lives, the safety bought so dearly, the watch kept so that others could sleep. For a moment in the ruin you can feel the weight of every night that people once passed inside these walls, and how hard those nights were, and how they lived through them anyway, together, and woke, and did it again. From today's view, the emptying of the castles looks like simple progress, the grim, cold fortress giving way at last to the warm and comfortable house, obsolete stone left to the grass. From their view, it was the end of the only world they had known, the day the walls that had kept the dark and the danger out for 400 years were no longer needed, because the age of the fortress was over, and a safer, softer age had quietly begun. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep you warm. And that's what's so chilling.
It is a summer morning at Conwy, in the north of Wales, 740-odd years after James of St. George raised its towers out of the rock for Edward I. And the castle is still there. It stands where it has always stood, on its gray shelf of stone above the water, its 8 great towers still rising, its curtain walls still holding the shape they were given in the 1820s. It is a ruin now and a monument, roofless, floorless in places, open to the weather it was built to shut out. And on a morning like this one, it is full of visitors, moving quietly through it in the light, cameras in their hands, children on the worn steps, the sea wind coming off the estuary the way it always has. Go up. The spiral stair is still there, winding around its worn stone newel, and the steps are hollowed, each one dished into a shallow curve by 7 centuries of feet, by every servant and soldier and lord who ever climbed them in the dark with a rushlight, and by every visitor who has climbed them since in the daylight. The stone is cold under your hand on the way up, even now, even in July. It was always cold. It has not warmed in 700 years. The great hall stands open to the sky. The roof is long gone, and the floor is grass, and the light pours down into a room that once fought so hard to keep the light out. There is the hearth, a great cold fireplace in the wall, blackened once, pale now, where the fire was banked each night and guarded through the dark, and woken each morning, and where nothing has burned in longer than anyone can easily say. There is the arrow slit, the narrow gap that let in so little, with the same thin blade of daylight falling through it onto the same stone. And out along the top of the wall runs the wall walk, grass-grown and empty, where the watch once paced its endless round. Stand up there for a moment, in the morning, where the watchman stood in the worst of the cold. All night, through this whole long journey, there was a sound, the slow, even tread on the wall overhead, a footstep, a pause, another footstep. It is gone now,
There is no footfall on the stone but your own, and the wind where the watch once passed, and the small far sounds of the town below. The sound that measured every night this castle ever kept has fallen silent, and it is ours now only to imagine, standing in the quiet where the man once walked. And here is the thing about all the people who passed their nights inside these walls. Almost none of them left a name. The lord and the lady we might trace, the rest, the servants asleep on the hall floor, the groom among the horses, the boy who rose coldest to begin the bread, the fire servant at the hearth, the watchman freezing on this wall, left nothing. 100,000 cold nights were passed inside this stone, and not one of them was written down. They lived their long dark winters here together, and woke and did it again, and then they were gone, and the record closed over them without a trace.
But the stone remembers the shape of their nights, the hollowed stair remembers the feet, the blackened hearth remembers the fire, the empty wall walk remembers the watch. Inside these walls you belonged to the castle, and they belonged to a castle that is a ruin now, and to a memory that still, this morning, brings us up the same stair and out onto the same walls to stand exactly where they stood. That is the strange gift of the surviving stone, that it kept their place for them long after it could no longer keep them. It was built to keep the enemy out. It was never built to keep them warm. And here we are, 700 years later, standing in the warmth and the light inside the cold stone that once held them through the dark, the same walls, the same hearth, the same worn stair, no longer cold and sealed and dangerous, but safe and sunlit and quiet and full of people who came only to look and to wonder and to go home again at the end of the day to warm rooms the castle's builders could never have imagined. The long night is over. The gray at the arrow slit became morning, the way it always did, the way it always does. The gate stands open now and will not be barred at dusk. The fire will not be banked. No one will climb to the wall to keep the dark. The castle stands in the light, warm at last on the outside, cold and patient within, remembering everything and needing nothing, above the water where it has always been. Sleep well.